don't think I need this, but I will have it there. All right. Hello. As was said, my name is Jessica Williams. I'm the director of the International Network for Incarcerated Girls and Women, Single-Sex Prisons Australia, and an activist organization called the Direct Action Movement. I have been an activist and a lobbyist and feminist for many years, having engaged in a wide variety of actions and campaigns. Yes?
A little bit smaller, please.
Gotcha. I'm very glad to be here as a presenter and as an attendee, and I just appreciate very much that Anna has organized another very successful women's conference for us. So I will repeat, I have been an activist, lobbyist, and feminist for many years, having engaged in a wide variety of actions and campaigns. My presentation today is based on what I've learned through those years and what I've learned during some uniquely challenging personal experiences. And my presentation was heavily influenced from lessons learned from women that came before me. I have organized my presentation into two parts. First, I will discuss how we can achieve solutions through combining political lobbying with other forms of activism, using more methods of direct action and civil disobedience. The second part is about how to make our movement more effective and sustainable through implementing structure. For years, women across Australia have consistently lobbied all levels of government across all parties for many reasons pertaining to our rights: to put a stop to the encroachment of gender identity ideology, to end the epidemic of male violence against women and their children, to ban pornography, and to end the sexual exploitation and sex trafficking of women and children in Australia, to name a few. We have made progress in many of these areas. However, women are still being ignored on multiple fronts. Progress is often made too slowly, and it's just not good enough. I believe it is time to adopt civil disobedience and direct action tactics to amplify our political lobbying efforts. I believe we can present solutions to our government and apply pressure on the government to adopt those solutions. We can do this instead of waiting on government bodies to decide that different solutions are needed in the first place, and then waiting longer for them to decide which solutions to implement and when to implement them. We know the solutions, and I believe we can do better at making our representatives implement those solutions in a timely manner. There are a range of methods of activism, from political lobbying through to illegal forms of direct action, which can be used to raise more public awareness and, importantly, to apply that pressure to key officials. We can each be confident that all of the women that came before us partook in every single method of activism by nonviolent and violent means. In 1930, British suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel and Sylvia founded the Women's Social and Political Union, which better became known as the Suffragettes. Members of the Suffragettes were prepared to use violence to get what they wanted. When they campaigned for the right to vote in 1912, they chained themselves to railings, detonated bombs, smashed shop windows, and went on hunger strike. They even burned down unoccupied houses and churches, and many women went to prison as a result. In November 1909, Teresa Garnett, a suffragette who had previously chained herself to a statue in the Houses of Parliament and who had been accused of biting a prison warden during a previous stay in jail, confronted Winston Churchill while brandishing a whip. Teresa repeatedly struck Churchill, screaming, "Take that in the name of the insulted women of England." Irish suffragette Mary Maloney is most well known for her acts of protest in 1908 in Scotland, where, again, Winston Churchill was running to regain a seat in Parliament. For a week, she would appear at Churchill's speaking engagements, demand that he apologize for insulting remarks he had made about the women's suffrage movement, and then proceed to drown him out by ringing a large bell every time he refused and attempted to carry on with his planned remarks. And it was very effective. On at least one occasion, he gave up entirely on giving his intended speech. Of course, we have a very rich history of feminist activism in Australia, as we got into a little bit earlier. In March 1965, Merle Thornton and Rosalie Bogner chained themselves to the bar of the Regatta Hotel in Brisbane in protest of women being excluded from drinking in public bars. This act was a defining moment in Australian feminism and resulted in the repeal of Section 59A of the Queensland Liquor Act in 1970. As discussed earlier, on October 21st, Zelda de Prono chained herself to the entrance of the Commonwealth Building in Melbourne, Victoria, in support of equal pay. The ploy worked wonderfully. Other women supported the equal pay campaign by boarding trams and paying only 75 cents of the $1 fare, since at the time, women's wages were set at 75% that of men's. Around the same time, a more revolutionary challenge to women's traditional position in society was emerging in Australia, known as the Women's Liberation Movement. In huge street marches, protests, and public meetings, they demanded an end to discrimination on the basis of sex or sexual preference and campaigned for a range of reforms. While the women's liberation movement often tried to avoid all forms of hierarchical organization, others saw the need for political organization to advance the feminist agenda. The Women's Electoral Lobby was formed in 1972 and went on to become an influential force in politics at the state and federal level. Times have changed significantly since the era of our suffragist sisters. We must acknowledge that while our rights are under constant attack, we also have a lot to lose. We are not at the point of no return. We can say, I would die for this, likely never having to test that theory. What we do have to do is individually decide what we are willing to sacrifice and what types of activism we are willing to engage in. Political lobbying is a very effective method of activism, which I engage in, and I believe we can further enhance. We normally are in a reactive position for government consultations and inquiries, responding after the fact, once the government has already made a lot of decisions about the consultation and draft bills. I suggest that when feasible, we should be providing solutions to the government ourselves. And I have a few that I have created, and I know that there are other ones. So a few examples. The Universal Declaration on the Rights of Incarcerated Girls and Women is a lobbying tool that I created that can be used worldwide. It raises the bar on the minimum standards regarding the human rights of incarcerated women and girls, and of course, sex is a very well-defined and protected category within it. The Australian government guidelines on the relief and support of girls and women exiting the sex trade in Australia. These guidelines do not attack the sex trade itself, but instead focus on providing women and girls effective levels of ongoing support to permanently exit the trade. There has been federal interest in this document from both Labor and Liberal, and I believe if more women put pressure, that we can get them to adopt these guidelines. Demands for change, ending male violence against women and children, is a list of demands to the Australian government, media, and to Australian men. It is a list of practical ways to address the core issues which male violence against women and children stem from. To further strengthen our strategic lobbying efforts, women should join local political party branches. Join whichever party you feel deep in your heart you want to lead, and join and fight for that party, regardless of everything else. This is strategic and intentional and should be implemented across as many jurisdictions and states as possible. Once we do that, we can work together to present coordinated motions at conferences and meetings and cast coordinated votes. Going another step further, let's get women in key positions in national associations and groups and committees. There is so much we can do in the realm of politics that we're not doing yet that can make us much more effective in the short and the long term. Backing up our political efforts with a range of methods of activism is something I advocate for. Whether groups decide to be peaceful, nonviolent, or not, Learning the history and the practical tactics of nonviolent direct action has proven to be extremely useful for movements throughout the history of protest. I advocate for and facilitate women becoming formally trained in nonviolent direct action. Some of the many skills and techniques women can learn about by completing NVDA training together are cohesive and effective messaging strategies, how to decide which actions and campaigns are best to do and which we should steer away from, how our actions affect the wider movement, how to work together to compromise while remaining effective and true to our core values and aims, and what the different roles that exist within activism are, because there is a role for everyone and on every level. And then we can coordinate a range of actions like banner drops, sit-ins, occupations, rallies, boycotts, strikes, and much more. One of the most important topics that we can explore together is group structure and leadership. It was well into my years of activism and feminism before I read The Tyranny of Structurelessness by Jo Freeman. When I did read it, it felt like Jo had pulled thoughts right out of my head and put them on paper, some verbatim. And I would like to share some of those insights with all of you. Jo tells us, the basic problems didn't appear until individual groups exhausted the virtues of consciousness raising and decided they wanted to do something more specific. At this point, they usually floundered because most groups were unwilling to change their structure when they changed their task. Women had thoroughly accepted the idea of structurelessness without realizing the limitations of its uses. And she says this was done out of a blind belief that no other means could possibly be anything but oppressive. Sorry, I'll repeat that. She said this was done out of a blind belief that no other means could possibly be anything but oppressive. She warns that within the women's movement, structurelessness is usually most strongly advocated by those who are the most powerful, whether they are conscious of their power or not. She advised us that if the movement is to move beyond these elementary stages of development, it will have to disabuse itself of some of its prejudices about organization and structure. There is nothing inherently bad about either of these. They can be and often are misused, but to reject them out of hand because they are misused is to deny ourselves the necessary tools to further development. In my opinion, the women's movement has not yet fully moved on from these elementary stages of development some 50 years later. As Freeman observed, and as I have also observed, there is no such thing as a structureless group. Whether formal or informal, deliberate or unintentional, structure will set in, and informal default structures are often not balanced or fair in delegation, distribution, or treatment. Freeman goes on to talk about how structurelessness has created the STAR system in the women's movement and explains, only 3 techniques have ever been developed for establishing mass group opinion: the vote or referendum, the public opinion survey questionnaire, and the selection of group spokespeople at an appropriate meeting. The women's liberation movement has used none of these to communicate with the public. She says that while we do not consciously choose our spokespeople, the movement has thrown up women anyway for various reasons. Quote, "These women represent no particular group or established opinion. They know this and usually say so. But because there are no official spokespeople, nor any decision-making body that the press can query when it wants to know the movement's position on a subject, these women are perceived as the spokespeople." End quote. She correctly claims that this creates anger amongst women. She explains that because they were not selected by the women in the movement to represent the movement's views, they are resented when the press presumes that they speak for the movement. But as long as the movement does not select its own spokespeople, such women will be placed in that role by the press and the public, regardless of their own desires. She goes on to further explain that this has several negative consequences for both the movement and the women labeled stars. First, because the movement didn't put them in the role of spokesperson, the movement cannot remove them. Then the press put them there, and only the press can choose not to listen. The movement has no control in the selection of its representatives to the public as long as it believes that it should have no representatives at all. Second, women put in this position often find themselves viciously attacked by their sisters, and this achieves nothing for the movement and is painfully destructive to the individuals involved. She warns us that if the movement continues deliberately to not select who shall exercise power, it does not thereby abolish power. All it does is abdicate the right to demand that those who do exercise power and influence be responsible for it. Freeman warns us about the political impotence that comes along with structurelessness, as well as our movement being susceptible to negative influence if we go without formal structure. She states quite accurately, the more unstructured a movement, the less control it has over the directions in which it develops and the political actions in which it engages. Whoop. Jo was thoughtful enough to give us a set of 7 principles which we can apply while testing different structures to see what works best for our movement. Delegation. When people are selected to do a task, preferably after expressing an interest or a willingness to do it, they are more inclined to be committed to that task. Responsibility. Requiring all those to whom authority has been delegated to be responsible to those who selected them. Individuals may exercise power, but it is the group that has ultimate say over how that power is exercised. Distribution of authority among as many people as is reasonably possible. This prevents monopoly of power and requires those in positions of authority to consult with many others in the process of exercising it. Rotation of tasks among individuals. Responsibilities which are held too long by one person, whether formally or informally, can come to be seen as that person's property, and they're not easily relinquished or controlled by the group. Allocation of tasks along rational criteria. Selecting someone for a position because they are liked by the group or giving them hard work because they are disliked serves neither the group nor the person in the long run. Diffusion of information to everyone as frequently as possible. We know that information is power, but access to information enhances one's power. Equal access to resources needed by the group. A member who maintains a monopoly over a needed resource can unduly influence the use of that resource. Skills and information are also resources, and members' skills can be equitably available only when members are willing to teach those skills to the other women. To close, I will share some of Jo's words that I've paraphrased. Once the movement no longer clings tenaciously to the ideology of structurelessness, it is free to develop those forms of organization best suited to its healthy functioning. This does not mean that we should go to the other extreme and blindly imitate the traditional forms of organization, but neither should we blindly reject them all. We will have to experiment with different kinds of structuring and develop a variety of techniques to use for different situations. But before we can proceed to experiment intelligently, we must accept the idea that there is nothing inherently bad about structure itself, only its excess use. Thank you.